Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your infinite presence, that everything we do be a perfect reflection of your divine guidance. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's meditate now for a few minutes. Om. Peace. Amen. Our subject today is the subconscious mind. And from the point of view of the spiritual path, especially the path of self-realization, it's a very interesting subject because we don't usually focus on the subconscious. We're much more focused on the superconscious. The whole idea of the path of self-realization is that we are working to transcend this world. So our focus tends to be on going beyond our human experience. But it's very difficult to go beyond your human experience if your human experience has you by both ankles and is holding you down. I saw a PBS program that was actually quite beautiful. It was called Kingdoms in the Sky or something like that. And it's a whole series of programs about mountain zones. And this one was about the Himalayas, which of course would be of special interest to anyone with Indian past lives, as I have. But they also included in there, not as the main focus by any means, but just as part of it, a Tibetan Buddhist monk who lives way up in the mountains, and he goes up to this cave, which they have outfitted up in these places at about 12 or 13,000 feet, that he lived in, or lives in, 8 months of the year in absolute and total seclusion. And food is brought to him and put at some place, some deposit point, and then he goes and picks it up. So during those 8 months, he doesn't see anyone at all. And they have a close-up of his beautiful, serene face and his wonderful eyes. And just talking about when you're high in the mountains like that, far away from the world, your mind and your vision become extremely clear. Stephen, would you mind shutting that door? Because the noise is a lot. Your mind and your vision become exceedingly clear. That way of life is not foreign to my way of understanding. This last year, I actually spent months in seclusion working on writing, which made it possible. I couldn't have gone into meditation seclusion for that long, but I could writing. But I really experienced more directly than I ever had in my life that there is a total reality that you can tap into that's completely outside the world we live in, and that there is a greater depth to that world rather than less. Now, only a very few people have the actual karma to live like that. So it's really not, in this day and age, something that most of us will get to touch into for more than a few months, if we're lucky, every now and then. But there is a reality to these ascending levels of consciousness that is really an expansion of our awareness. And even though it's not obvious to most people, the more expanded our awareness, the higher our perspective, the more effectively we can deal with every aspect of life. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Sri Yukteswar, who is the guru of Paramhansa Yogananda, trains Yogananda for his life of service and discipleship. And one of the things that Yogananda talks about in that book is that his master, Sri Yukteswar, seldom corrected him spiritually, but he often corrected his behavior in mundane ways. And Yogananda said he had picked up the convenient idea that being a spiritual person exempted him from ordinary attention to ordinary matters. There's a whole chapter in the book about how Yogananda loses his prize cauliflowers because he neglected to remember to lock the door of the ashram. It's just a humorous way of putting the point across of what Sri Yukteswar called the importance of learning to behave. So learn to behave has always been sort of one of the words that permeates through our spiritual path. So I'm going to show us one more thing. Could you open the windows on that side so we can have some cross currents since I shut the door? Thank you. So if we take as part of our spiritual life, which we already know is part of our ordinary life, the necessity not only to have transcendental experiences, but also to relate properly and effectively to the world around us, then we begin to get engaged in more than the superconscious level of living. In fact, in about 1979, Swami Kriyananda created an entire course which he called Superconscious Living, but the idea of superconscious living was to deal with the fact that we actually operate on 3 levels of consciousness, and none of them will work properly unless the others are also engaged properly. So what I'm going to draw from, not entirely, but to a large extent, is that course. And the reason Swami wrote that course is he said, it doesn't do any good to tell people that they have to, transcend this world, because everybody has to operate in this world. And what we have to learn to do is we have to take the highest teachings and understand how they apply all the way down to the most mundane experiences. I mean, that hardly needs to be said in Silicon Valley. But we ourselves as devotees, at least I'll speak for myself to a certain extent here, it's not always been clear, especially in a tradition that's based on India, where this transcendent attitude toward life is so central. It's not always been clear how ordinary emotions and feelings and actions and attitudes, how it all comes together. And until we can really live an integrated life, what happens to us is we're always being ambushed by things we don't understand. There was a couple that decided to get married. It was a short-lived and unfortunate alliance because neither of them had the foggiest idea where their own personal angst and suffering came from. And so when they were together, one or the other of them would do something that would make this one feel bad, and because there seemed to be a cause and effect relationship between that action and this response, there was a corresponding inclination to blame. And the sequence of events was entirely incidental, not causal. But because neither individual had any idea what was going on below the conscious level, they just found it impossible to work it out between them. Many alliances, especially in the West, are temporary. Even though we try to make them permanent, they're temporary. Sometimes it's genuinely because there's an incompatibility, but more often a person is unhappy and finds themselves unhappy with someone and thinks that I would be happier without that someone. And to a certain extent, that's not always false, because in solitude we can sometimes control what enters our atmosphere better. And if we can control it, it sometimes gives us the impression that we've overcome it. And none of which spiritually ever ultimately works. And what I've observed on Master's path, the path of self-realization in Kriya Yoga after almost 50 years, is that sooner or later everything has to be dealt with. I mean, the nature of true spiritual freedom is that all alternating attractions and aversions have been harmonized and resolved. Think of it in a really simple way. The spiritual truth is the origin point of our being. The center point of our consciousness is the infinite. And before creation, the infinite is there in absolute stillness. When we are manifested, and I was listening to Swami talk about all this just yesterday on a recording. It made no more sense to me than it has ever made. But at some point, we were manifested, and then this whole saga began. I listened carefully to see if I could understand it this time, and I can't. But nonetheless, we find ourselves here. And the why of how we got here doesn't change the necessity to resolve the suffering that we experience. And even knowing why wouldn't make the necessity to resolve our suffering any different. So in the end, I pay no attention to that part of it. But somehow or another, we are manifested from stillness. We enter into duality, and we begin this endless cycle of opposites. That everything is good for a while, and then not so good, and then not so good, and then good. Swami is fond of quoting Satya Sai Baba. A pleasure is the interval between two pains. A pain is the interval between two pleasures. You can use joy and unhappiness if you like. It's not a cynical remark. It's just a statement about the fact that nothing stays the same. We get it completely set. Maybe it even lasts for 50 years. But in the day that it stops, it's now. And our experience is the same as it was when it started. Whether death or old age or civil war or natural catastrophe or other people changing, sooner or later it goes like this, back and forth. And we live in a world where we have preferences, all of us. We have strong preferences. The likes and dislikes of the heart is how Sri Yukteswar described it. So the heart is drawn in this direction and averse in this direction. And so we spend most of our lives in a state of tension, trying to hold on to that which seems positive to us and hold at bay that which isn't. So instead of living in the calm, still center of our own being, we're always engaged in these push-pull opposites. Now, in order for us to relax into that center, and this is the odd part of the spiritual life, is that we don't really actually go anywhere, nor do we actually attain or develop anything. What we're doing constantly is we're moving back and forth and sort of passing right through without noticing our own actual point of origin. Or we circle around it, or maybe we're running in a concentric circle. All we have to do is, once we stop doing that, the place we go back to is actually our point of origin. Many times when people die, if they have the capacity, that often a very deep sense of peaceful surrender will come over to them at the end. Because it will now be impossible to keep chasing back and forth. And very often in death, or in these death and return experiences people have, they discover that what they've been chasing madly everywhere was always sitting right there in front of him. They were just too busy running around it to ever notice. Now we can get this idea in our head really easily, but it just isn't so easy to break the habit and to perceive the difference between our subjectively imposed likes and dislikes and anything that's actually objective reality. Speaking of my unfortunate friends and their brief marital alliance, it was just impossible to persuade either of them that the other one wasn't acting evil, because that person acted and I suffered. Therefore, there must have been, something there. Because we carry within us from many, 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 many incarnations all of these past impressions which form our very concept of reality. Now, psychology has woken up to a certain part of this and now gives enormous emphasis to childhood and childhood experiences and how we grew up, because people have begun to be able to draw a pattern from what your parents did to you or what happened to you as a child and the decisions you made and the kind of adult you became. And so if a person today goes to a psychiatrist or psychologist to talk about something they're suffering, often the psychologist will take them back. So what happened to when you were 6, when you were 7? And it's possible to draw a lot of cause and effect relationships, and people understand. I've shared with you all the fact that I grew up in a very intellectual family, and we used to like to have very intellectual conversations. And my brother, especially, and I, to some extent, were also engaged in competitive debate. And so our conversations tended to follow along the lines of debate. And in a debate, especially in this way, in a debate, you present all your best arguments with as much energy as you can, then you stop, and then the next person presents all their best arguments with as much energy as you can, and then I try to counter those arguments, and then you get a rebuttal. Now, in a competitive debate, all of that is formalized. But the principle is, when it's my turn, I explain what I think with as much energy I can, as much clarity, and if it's not a competition, then you do the same, and then we weigh the 2 points of view to decide. But it's all, in a sense, oppositional. And the expectation is, I try as hard as I can, you try as hard as you can, and we enjoy it. We enjoy the process. I thought debate and conversation were the same thing until I was 50 years old, which was really a long time. So whenever I was in conversation, if there was a subject under discussion, I would simply present my point of view with as much energy as I could and all the convincing reasons that I had. And then I would sit back and expect everybody else to do the same. And they rarely did. Only the people who were trained and brought up the way I would understood the nature of the game. Other people just felt totally intimidated and felt that what I was trying to do was just to shut down discussion. And you would think I would have figured it out sooner, but I didn't. Because I grew up that way. And I liked that way of conversing. And despite the impression I gave of being so committed to my idea, I wasn't really committed to it. I just wanted others to understand why I had that position, so then they could tell me why it might be wrong. And whenever anybody told me something that was counter to it, I would immediately change over if it made sense to me, or I would counter again, and we'd just go like that. I didn't understand that not everybody's mind works that way, not everybody appreciates that kind of discussion. Some people have to be coaxed, others are insecure. Give the whole story like that. I had no idea, absolutely none. And as a consequence, the response I got from people sometimes utterly bewildered me. It's all crazy now, 20 years later, I can say, how could I not have known that? But I didn't, absolutely did not. I was totally surprised. My nephew, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, who is probably taking his bar exam about now and passing it. He was born a lawyer. Like, as soon as he could talk, he would argue his case. His poor mother, he argued his case all through his childhood, very effectively. I think he'll be very effective in his chosen profession. He was just born an attorney. That's how he sees things. These are the rules. This is how it goes. I'm going to explain it to you. I'm 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, just with that kind of energy. So a very helpful part of this story is the concept of reincarnation. And psychology is not wrong. It's just limited in its perspective, and therefore sometimes has to put too much weight on events that fall within the framework of this birth and this death. So there can be a very strong characteristic in someone, and if a psychologist is committed to there being nothing before birth, then he has to find an explanation in things that happened, which can lead to unfortunate abuses like implanted memories and things like that, just in order to try to make sense out of the nonsensical. If you accept the idea of reincarnation, which of course is part of the principles of self-realization, then the whole system becomes infinitely more interesting. And it isn't as if the events that you can chronicle in this life are not relevant, but we start from the fact that I came into those circumstances because I was already leaning in whatever direction they took me. In my family, I was very confused for a long time because for various reasons, the family that I was born into and raised in, which in every way was a very good family, and I'm very grateful for them, but they also exacerbated some of my worst qualities. And for many, many years, I kept asking myself, why didn't I have the sense to be born somewhere that would balance those qualities instead of just making them worse and worse? And then finally, I realized it when I was counseling someone. And it was so obvious. I'm surprised I didn't notice earlier. We never put out the energy to change until we're so miserable that the effort to change seems less difficult than the misery that we're experiencing from staying as we are. It's what I call the preference for the known misery. Even though this may be miserable, at least it's familiar, I know what its parameters are. If I have to put out the energy and risk becoming someone else, I don't know if it's worth it, which is why people cling to their delusions. So it occurred to me that what my family did for me is they pushed certain of my less attractive characteristics to such an extreme for me that I noticed. And I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I mean, they might have been suppressed, but they wouldn't have been transcended. Transcended is when we actually genuinely understand that this way of being is not bringing me what I want. I mean, a friend of mine, and it's a fairly common question that people ask these days, but the first time it was asked to me, I was really surprised. I was talking to her about some syndrome that I was running that was making me very unhappy, and I gave the whole big story about what it was like and what I was doing. And she said, "Oh, so how is that working? How is that helping you?" And I wanted first to say, well, it's not helping me at all. That's why I'm talking to you. But it was actually a very good question, because when I really stopped and thought about it, I realized that whole way of approaching life kept me preoccupied. And it held at bay a whole series of other things that I would have had to face if I had ever really let go of this issue. So I realized, it's actually working quite well for me. Because much as I don't like this, without it, it would be worse. So there's a fact about our existence, which is we don't change because other people tell us we would be better off if we did. We change only when our own experience becomes so persuasive that we're really ready to say, all right, now I'll try something else. I mean, all of you, the mere fact that you come to Ananda at all means that some part of you has understood that, because nobody comes here who wants to stay the same. Because we just don't reinforce the status quo here. We reinforce a glorious potential, but we don't really reinforce the status quo. We don't denigrate it. This is not, a sinful world. It's not a horrible world. It just simply is what it is. And when you commit yourself to it, you receive what it gives you. And then one just has to make one's own decision as to whether or not that's enough. Okay? So the principle of reincarnation, the principle of our experiences forming our worldview, the principle that we, because of our experiences, we form a worldview that we not only become convinced is true, but we become committed to defending. These are all the circumstances that we're living with. And then when we become interested in the spiritual path and have a wish to sort of transcend all these limitations, then suddenly all of these conditions become very relevant. Because otherwise, the way I began to understand it, I understood it in myself. Well, this was the perfect example. When I first came onto the spiritual path, I lived in our community up in Grass Valley, a big rural community, especially in those days in the early 70s. Very simple life at that time, very actually primitive living, but very enjoyable. And I lived at the part of the community called Ayodhya, which was just a little enclave about a mile from what we called downtown, which didn't look anything like downtown. But the building where the publications building is was about a mile from where I lived. None of us had cars, so we just walked over the hill every morning. It was wonderful. And then I was due at publications. We tried to work a regular 8-hour day, so I was due there at 9 o'clock. One morning, I started out in time, walking in time to get to work, but one thing after another kept happening that I wasn't exactly irresponsible, but I was inclined always to recalculate to my own advantage. That's how I put it. If I saw something that might be more fun, I would just go with what seemed like more fun to me. Fun to me was helping other people and doing good things. It wasn't like I'd go off and get drunk or just go lie down and read a book. But so-and-so needed help in the garden, and then this one wanted to talk to me about that, and then there was a little project over here. So I set off from work at 8:30 to get there at 9, and I arrived at 4 in the afternoon. And my friend, who was also nominally my boss, who was a woman of few words, said simply this, "Good morning," like that. But it spoke volumes. But the interesting thing to me, you see, is I'd set out in a straight line, and then one thing or another took me away. And I began to gradually realize, I saw it first in others, and then I really saw it in myself. We start with a certain intention. And before that intention can express itself, often it gets deflected by all these karmic patterns. And I'll explain the vrittis, they're called, all these vortices of energy in our spine. So we start out meaning to do something helpful, and we end up over here often doing something hurtful, or at least something that isn't exactly what we intended. And it's very bewildering from the inside, because we're conscious of what we intended and are hardly aware of the fact that it got deflected like this. Swamiji once said to me something about humor. And he talked about someone whose humor was actually unkind, even though they didn't intend for it to be unkind. But whenever they would start out with a humorous remark, it would get all snarled up in these vrittis, and it would come out unkind. And the person would always look really bewildered, couldn't understand, but there was an orientation that they didn't understand. Now, there's a great deal of difference in ourselves and in other people. Once we begin to understand this about ourselves, we can begin to understand other people a lot better. Because a lot of people do things that end up being very hurtful. But very few people actually intend to be hurtful. I mean, there are people who do, but very, very few compared to the number who actually do. And most of the time, when people attack, it's because they're afraid. And when you see someone attacking, and you think that they're mean and they're horrible and you try to crush them back, it doesn't really do anything to untie the original knot. Swami Kriyananda was so remarkable, certainly speaking for myself and everything I observed, because he always seemed to understand not what a person did, but why. He always understood why I did what I did. When other people would judge my actions, he would judge my intentions. Judge is not the right word, but he would see me according to what I intended and then help me understand why it didn't come out that way. Like, conversation is not debate. If I don't know that conversation is not debate, I can't figure out why people don't want to talk to me. I'm just like confused. Why don't they invite me to their meetings? Well, because you're not any fun. You stop the discussion before it starts. What? I mean, you've seen it. We're all like that. Okay. According to Swamiji's superconscious living system, which is really just a description of how we work, I know that you hear me say this at various times, but there are certain principles of the spiritual path, and since some of you are longtime devotees who've been hearing these teachings a long time, certain ideas, if you can get them really clear in your mind, become enormously helpful. And the 3 levels of consciousness and what their characteristics are and how they affect us is one of those principles. This life in this world is not as confusing as it seems if we have just a few clear ideas. That doesn't mean it's easy to unravel, but at least it's less confusing. So Swamiji talks very simply that there's 3 levels of consciousness. And the subconscious is what we're talking about today, but it all has to go together. I don't think that pen is very... Subconscious, which we've already talked about. Conscious, and then superconscious. Some people use the subconscious to sort of talk about this collective awareness, but in this way of thinking about it, we don't think about it so much that way. Okay. The subconscious is the collecting ground for everything that you experience. And, again, psychology, especially aided by hypnosis, has been able to unpack the fact. Also, death and return experiences have also begun to reveal this fact, that everything that happens to us is not forgotten. It might not be a part of our everyday memory, but when circumstances allow, we suddenly realize that everything we've experienced is still with us. One of my most favorite death and return stories by a man named Dr. Ritchie. He died of the influenza in World War II when he was in his early 20s. And he went into a life review in which he stood in a 360-degree movie, and he saw everything that happened from conception, being in his mother's womb, being born as a baby, all through his babyhood. And as he stood there, released from the limitations of the brain, because at the moment his brain was dead, it wasn't merely that he observed those, he remembered them, he felt them. When he saw those experiences, he realized that all of those experiences were a living part of his reactions in the moment. If we think about ourselves, we're a very amorphous entity, that which one calls oneself. Especially you think of yourself as the body, but children are very tiny and they have a very different physical reality. But if we remember any part of our childhood, we recognize that we were present, we were there. I was a particularly feisty, self-determined person, not a rebellious or misbehaving, but very exact. And I remember at the age of 10, mostly I got along well with my parents, but from about 10 to 13 or 14, I fell in with bad company as far as they were concerned. Good company was really, really dull. And these girls were really interesting. But they were more rude than my parents would have wanted. Perhaps they were even worse than that, I don't know. But I remember telling my mother, declaring to my mother, I am either a good kid or a bad kid. No, I started differently. I said, the die is cast. I'm either a good kid or a bad kid, and there's nothing you can do about it now. Now, I'm sure that my mother must have had to fight hard to keep a straight face, but given her skill in mothering, she did, and I'm sure she just laughed hilariously with my father later when I wasn't in the room. But the fact of the matter is, it was true. You know, it was a little melodramatic for a 10-year-old, but it was a fact. I knew it. I knew that who I was beyond the reach of anybody, even my parents. That it really was. I was predetermined. I didn't know anything about reincarnation or self-realization or anything like that, but I was standing there and I was myself. I was their child. They could direct my life, but I was myself and I knew it. So when we, so the fact that we don't necessarily remember all these experiences doesn't mean that they haven't woven together to form the fabric of who we are. I mean, every one of us, if you think, we have certain inclinations. I have a tremendous inclination for words, and I have become a speaker, and more recently a writer. You know, and I like music. I have a certain feeling for music, but I don't sing. I don't play an instrument. You know, it's sort of, I touched it very lightly, but it just went away. Words were and are my medium of communication. Other people are visual. They paint, you know, or they go out in nature, or it's relationships with people, or numbers, you know, or food, or cooking, or just anything. We all have these enormous inclinations, and we move with them. And who we are and how we think, we don't really know where all those forces are coming from, but they're extremely distinct. And even as children, they're extremely distinct. At the age of 10, I declared it to my parents, and it was amusing, but it was a fact also, irrefutable. And so where that is in our being, so to speak, is that level of consciousness that we call subconsciousness. And we call it subconsciousness because it's, for almost everyone, it's below the level of conscious awareness, that's sub, but that doesn't mean it's not constantly influencing and defining us. In fact, that's what makes it so complicated. It's below the level of conscious awareness, but it is constantly determining our response to just about everything. And that's why we're so confusing. That's why I set out to get to work at 9 and I get there at 4 o'clock. That's why I set out to say something humorous and say something mean, or to say something comforting and say something awkward, is because below the level of the conscious mind, there's all these forces pushing me. And the subconscious collects not merely what happened from the time we came out of the womb, but from all the incarnations before. And this is the science of the chakras. And the chakras are the repository for all our incarnational experiences. And the chakras are a non-physical reality. They're the energy blueprint. So when we take off the physical body, the energy blueprint is what remains, which is why in all these death and return stories, and now in all the movies, the person's body falls away, but the person, completely intact, gets up and goes on, because the energy pattern created the body. And so the body can be taken off and the energy pattern remains intact. And of course the energy pattern, the nature of an energy pattern is that it's constantly shifting according to the energy that is added to it. So every time anything happens, the subconscious remembers. And we can't think of it like a physical thing. It happens on a non-physical realm. It's a vibration of energy, okay, and it goes like this. If you think of consciousness as being a spectrum from complete unawareness, virtual unawareness of any higher reality except the physical. I mean, you can think of it on the animal level like a worm, or a human being who just has a very, very dull consciousness, all the way to the point of Christ realization. And between understanding that I am an aspect of the infinite to not even knowing there is such a thing as an infinite, you can see that there's just many, 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 many choices. And people do not sit in little blocks. It's sort of like we're kind of a smear, somewhere along that whole spectrum. But every time we respond to anything in life, we are affirming our perception of reality as we understand it. That either I am one with the infinite, or I am some degree away from that. Whenever your action hurts me, I believe that you're separate from me. I believe that I'm vulnerable. I believe that my suffering is because of external circumstances. Whenever you do something and I wish to retaliate, it's because I don't understand that we are all infinite together. I think there's a separation here. If I can get you out of my universe, then all feel better. And we're all on a spectrum like this. Most of the time, I'm not given to murderous rages. But on one or two occasions in my life, I have thought, I'm glad I don't have a gun, because if I did, I might use it, like that. But if one can even imagine that feeling, one can also imagine a time when one would have used that gun. Most murders, not all, but most murders happen between people who know each other. Because I just get so mad at you, I think my life would be better if you weren't in it. And we just try it out. How did that work for you? Well, I spent a lot of time in prison. That's how it worked for me. Or whatever it might be. I didn't get what I wanted when I expunged that person. So it's on a spectrum like this. So each of those experiences is lodged in the subconscious through the medium of the chakras. The chakras is a closely related subject. They represent this spectrum. The lower and the higher chakras have positive and negative expressions, but they also represent vibrations of consciousness. And whenever something happens, a vibration of consciousness that matches that. It's not like, you murder Henry, and then Henry hangs out in your chakra. What hangs out in your chakra is the vibration of consciousness that thinks that if I take the life of another person, it will give me something I want. And that could have a number. I've actually seen people who've tried to give numbers to all these vibrations, but it's mathematical. The vibration just sits there. So in our subconscious, the medium for which this carries on is the chakras, and the chakras are vortices of energy, and the vortices of energy have magnetism. And so every time we're ready to respond to something, there is an inclination to continue in the way that we've always done. All of us, we get our little habits, don't we? I periodically develop the habit of having a cup of coffee with milk in the morning. I started that habit accidentally quite late in life when I was staying with a friend for a month who had the habit of making wonderful coffee every morning. And so every morning I woke up to his wonderful coffee. And by the time I got home, I woke up thinking about it. And I did it for about a year on my own. And one day I thought, I really don't think this is such a good idea for my particular body type, so I stopped until recently, and now I've started again. And it's not a really big deal one way or another, but I wake up thinking about it. It's a comfortable habit. I didn't this morning, and I'm still thinking about it. Instead, I have this wretched tea. And there's lots of other things that we have. Have been accustomed in my life to having debates. And so when an issue comes to mind, my automatic inclination is to analyze it and line up all my arguments and get all my reasons and see if someone has a better one. And I just do that because I'm accustomed to doing that, isn't so? If I'd been raised my father was a very, very ethical and moral man. My mother also, but my father was the one who really expressed it. And at the end of my parents' life, I really wanted them to feel positive as much as they could. And I remember I wrote a letter to them and I explained, that you raised us with such a strong moral code. I said that I cannot drop the tiniest piece of paper on the sidewalk. I am incapable of littering. And if I accidentally ever carelessly do, I will go back and pick it up. I just can't even live with it because it was so inculcated into me that you just don't do this. And I don't mean to a neurotic extent. It was just, you just don't do this. You don't tell lies. You don't take advantage of other people. I was inclined that way, but believe me, my family made sure that I didn't forget that that was important. So deeply, it's so deep in my vrittis that it's very, very hard for me to do it at all, which I'm, of course, extremely glad for. But all of us have all of these subconscious habits, and we tend to continue in the way that we're going. Now, the problem is, a lot of the things that we've done in the past, we have repented of. My murderous rage, I believe a psychic told me that I helped start the French Revolution, which I don't think is actually true, but it's apocryphal. And I have a very short fuse in terms of politics. And once, only once, someone here in Palo Alto, soon after we got this church in 1994, there was some issue about what kind of a sign we could put up. And someone just casually sent me down to talk to the Palo Alto city officials about what kind of sign we could put up. So I'm talking to this, and I can say some really rude things, to this twerp of a woman who has the power to determine what we can do. And I didn't like her, and I didn't like what she said. But I was close to enraged. I mean, my response was like so out of proportion to have this little government official have power over me. I mean, I had visions of firebombing the city hall. And I mean, it sounds funny now, but it wasn't funny. I was really ready to firebomb the city hall just to get rid of this woman and get rid of this power. Like, where did that come from? I've been on the spiritual path for decades. I'm a nice person. But somewhere in there, I had played all that out, and I'm sure that I did. I played it all out, and I reaped the consequences, but now I'm not political at all. Of course, I said, don't ever send me to the city again. There's others among us who can just talk to the city officials and have the same experience, and firebombs do not cross their minds. They're diplomatic, they're patient, they recognize, blah, 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 like that. So what we have is twofold. We have all those helpful things. I'm talking about the strong moral code my father and my family put into me. And I also have all those years of hot temper and using this gift of articulation in a way to fire people up to do things that I now regret. All of that, I carry it all the time. So, okay, let me go on for a minute now. So that's the subconscious. The subconscious is actually what you might call the past. But it's not the past in the sense that it's not forgotten, that it's forgotten. It's the past, and simply it's like what you are now is what the subconscious is. What you have become. I mean, the interesting thing you see is every single minute is different. By the time you leave this class, you'll be slightly different than you were when you walked in. You'll be a little older. You'll have had another experience. All the astrological signs will all have shifted, that minute amount. Everything will be different. To one of the characteristics of a highly spiritual person is the capacity to live in the now, to relate only to what is and what is going on in the moment. The subconscious is what you are now, but by definition that means what that's already behind you. Because everything has changed, we have to relate in the present now. A lot of times, now that you've adjusted everything to my standing up, I'll sit down again, okay? I was very impressed when I was friends with an older couple. They're about maybe 40 years older than me, and so when I was in my 30s, they were in their 70s and into their 80s. And it was very interesting because he and she were really very, very different. She was absolutely in the present moment. I mean, she was able to relate to me, she was able to relate to her grandchildren, to her nieces, to her grandnieces. Everybody she just talked to according to their reality, and her reality was extremely different. Her background, her expectation. She'd grown up she'd raised her family in a very privileged manner, and she lived out of the United States most of her child-raising years, in which she always had a house full of servants to help her. And there was her grandniece raising 3 children all on her own with her husband, but with no help. And my friend said to me, just like this, "I can't imagine raising children without full-time live-in help." I just thought, oh my, what a wonderful world you came from. But that was completely, she was just incredulous at what her niece was having to do. At the same time, she was completely in the present. And she could talk to them and understand them. You know what I mean. Her husband lived entirely in the past. And her husband would just wait until something would happen in the conversation where he could pull it into what he already knew. And then he was very lovely and very entertaining. But he couldn't be with us as we were. He would have to wait until he could pull it into his world as he knew it. And then he would entertain us with whatever he was entertaining. Because he was charming, you didn't mind very much. But it was extremely striking to me that in essence, he lived in his subconscious. And she didn't. Okay, the subconscious is what you have already accomplished, which by definition means it's in the past. So the subconscious can help us because we've learned a lot of things that are useful. I know that I shouldn't firebomb the city hall. It was very, very helpful that I've already done it, and that I remembered doing it. Most of the time I don't, but right then I did, and I knew that I shouldn't. It's my past, not my present, but I understand it. The superconscious is the future. Let's put it this way, it's our potential. This is, the subconscious is what we've already accomplished. This is, is it who we can become. And it doesn't just mean spiritually, it's everything. The subconscious can rearrange the present facts. The superconscious can be genuinely creative. When you get sensitive to creative work, art, music, your own or others, you'll begin to realize that much of art is subconscious. And I don't mean that it's asleep, I just mean that it's taking what already is and rearranging it. And some art is superconscious in that it's a genuine creative expression of something that is the amalgamation of what I may have been before, but I'm putting it in a way that it's never been done before. And great art is always superconscious because it's genuinely creative. The word Swami uses is original, but it means that it comes from your point of origin. I've had to go through a very long cycle of learning how to write because even though it's a natural talent of mine, it had a lot of emotional overtones and I had to learn to do it. But I really began to learn the difference between the fact that I could, this book that I just finished writing about Swami Kriyananda, I wrote it over the last 4 years, and especially in the last year and a half. But I tried to write this book in 2003, and meaning this book, meaning the one that I've just finished. I tried to write this book, the one that I just finished. I started in 2003. I wasn't able to. I put it aside and I wrote a different book, which is called Swami Kriyananda as We Have Known Him, which was a collection of stories. This is a chronological tale. So here's the interesting point. In 2003, I actually wrote a great deal of this book. I did in pretty much exactly the same way that I ended up writing it this last year, 15 years later. But the first one was entirely subconscious. I just sort of stream of consciousness wrote pages and pages of what I already knew. I don't know how else to put it. I'd forgotten that I did that, and I actually accidentally discovered it in the course of this year. And I found it useful because there was a certain amount of detail and information in there that I ended up putting into here. But there was nothing creative, and it wasn't coming from my origin. It was just a memoir, memories. I just spun memories. And of course you can spin memories in a creative, original way, but I didn't. I just sat down and did what I actually already knew. That's the only way I can describe it. And so there were a lot of interesting facts in it, but it had no life. But it was the same book. I was trying to write the one I finally wrote. Same format, same structure, same basic way of doing it, but one was subconscious, and then this one was actually creative. Because I actually let go of my preconceptions and I was in the now. I allowed it to tell me what it was really trying to be. That's the only way I can call it that. Now, that's artistic work. But in our lives, the conscious mind, which is the one here in the middle, the conscious mind doesn't really exist. I'm just going to put it like this. The conscious mind is the battleground. The battleground between the subconscious and the superconscious. Because the conscious mind is what we operate with most of the time. We relate to other people, we go to work, we do our jobs, whatever we do, and we're always having to decide, do I just go along with the way things have always been, or do I raise my energy, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, and actually tune in to my own potential. And that doesn't mean that you have to do things differently. It just means that you have to do it with full awareness rather than just because the machine is running. You know, am I in the now, or am I allowing myself to just move with the current of who I've always been? Most of the entire planet just moves with the current of who they've always been. Swami put it in this way. He said, most people drift waiting to be inspired by someone else's faith. Which is how positive movements happen, and which is also how horrible things happen. Because people are just drifting along and somebody comes along with more energy. Because the difference between subconscious and superconscious is really, really simple. It's about energy. And how much energy we're willing to put out, and how much awareness goes along with that energy. It's awareness and energy. You can put a lot of energy into subconscious things. That's what people do all the time. They fight like crazy for their point of view. Put a tremendous amount of energy into defending what I already know without ever stopping to ask, why do I think this is true? And does this really serve me anymore? All right, I'm going to give us a short break. We'll take about 10 minutes. The idea for breaks is that please don't start a whole nother reality anywhere. Just refresh yourselves and return. Okay. I did have eye surgery, but it makes it so that I can't read it. But I could read it enough to deduce the letters. No, I have big read. I had I'm a poster child for LASIK because I had it like at least 15 years ago, maybe 20. Absolutely have perfect distance vision. I've had to wear reading glasses ever since, but no, I was a big, Coke bottle kind of kid for all my life, and that was the most miraculous thing. I mean, not everyone has as great a success as I did. They had to do it twice to get it because of the stigmatism, but after the second time, and they told me in advance it might take 2. I've just been reading the street signs at night ever since without a bit of problem. It was really something to be without glasses after having worn them my whole life. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It was very disconcerting to go out in public without glasses on because I was just so accustomed to that. I never thought about it as a protection, but when I wasn't wearing it, I felt vulnerable. That's the word. During the intermission, I was asked a couple of questions, 3 questions actually, all of which relate to where we are. So I'm just going to start in with those questions. The first one had to do with coffee with milk, and I think it's very important to clarify this. But it actually stretches out into something that's more of a principle and not just a fact. Master actually recommended against coffee, but Swami himself said, I do almost everything that Master said, but I drink coffee. we have to prioritize our efforts. I'm going to sort of start there. You know, this is from delusion to spiritual freedom is a very long route. From first aspiration to final transcendence is a very long project. And when one begins, it seems like it's going to be really simple. I started onto the path of self-realization when I was about 19, 20, I was almost 20. No, I was actually almost 19. And I kind of thought 5 years maybe, and then I'd have it all worked out. I don't know why, but in my mind I thought 5 years, maybe because if you're 19, 5 years is a big percentage of your life. You know, and after 5 years, I barely had the first words, the first 2 vocabulary words memorized. I mean, it was just a completely different project than I thought it was. And given the magnitude of the number of changes and the degree of the magnitude of the revolution to which we are being called, a person has to really prioritize what you're going to put your energy into. Interestingly, Swamiji was talking with Sant Keshavdas, who was a well-known Indian teacher at that time, and the two of them were talking about, in this particular yuga, in this particular age on the planet, the material world is very dense, and physical purification can't take you very far in this particular era, because the physical world is so dense. In a very high age, where the veil between the physical and the spiritual world is very thin, a little bit of physical purification goes a long way. And I mean, it just happened to be their conversation, but they were saying that in this age, devotion is the power. Loving God is what really gives you power, not avoiding dairy or being a vegan or any of those things. Now, Master recommended a vegetarian diet, but he really recommended what he called proper etarianism. Find any simple diet that works for you and then don't think about it very much. In the 1920s, he encouraged vegetarianism, but it wasn't an era in which it was so popular. So it was more like he encouraged people away from red meat and so on. Nowadays, vegetarianism is really common, so people push to veganism and push to other things. And if you feel genuinely like it comes from your origin point, that that's what you want to do, it's appropriate, but one shouldn't mistake something relatively peripheral for the actual real goal. I've been through all of this. I was intensely fanatical about diet all through my 20s. And I arrived at Ananda in a very fanatical mood. And I hadn't eaten sugar in maybe 3 or 4 years, and I thought I was pretty close to cosmic consciousness as a result. Just one of the very first things that happened when I was at Ananda was in the very first summer in 1971. I went with Swami Kriyananda and a group of about 10 other people. From our community, we went into town, which was 20 miles away, Grass Valley, Nevada City. And whenever we went to town, we, meaning the collective Ananda, we always went to Swenson's ice cream parlor because we had no access to anything like that. So I'm there with Swami and about a dozen people, and just as it happened, he sat at the head of the table and I sat at the foot of the table, and there were 6 or 7 people on both sides of the table. And they were all ordering ice cream sundaes of various kinds, and they were all passing them back and forth, and Swami was right in the middle, everybody was sharing. I ordered 1 glass of water, no ice, please. And I sat there like this, sipping my ice, while they all ate ice cream. And thank you, God, it occurred to me that perhaps it was I who was out of step instead of all of them. It would have been very easy, if I had had a different set of vrittis, to become very judgmental and decide they weren't very spiritual because, after all, they were eating ice cream. Because I was pretty set in that direction. But because Swami was right in the middle of it, and he probably set the whole thing up just for me, it occurred to me that I was the one who was probably wrong. Now, that doesn't mean one should just indulge in ice cream, but he was trying to get the point across to me that some things are more important than others. But it also depends on who you are and what your stage of life is, and really how much energy you have for the battle. If you tighten the screws too much, then everything will crack and you'll lose everything. I mean, I ended up, eventually Swami taught me to cook, and eventually I started cooking for him. And cooking for him, I learned a wholly different attitude toward gracious living, you might say. Yogananda himself was a very good cook, and he opened a restaurant, and he had many, and they were all very creative and delicious, and he cooked in a very nice way, but in a simple, wholesome manner, but not fanatical. Now, the principle there is just a little bit about food. It's also just about you have to choose your battles, and you should use your energy for those things that are the most important. I mean, I was super keen on right diet and pretty casual about my judgment of other people. I was perfectly willing to condemn a great many people in the human race, but I didn't eat sugar. It's like I wasn't really using my willpower in the way that was really going to help me. And the fanaticism in that area only made me fanatical in other areas, not actually loving. One thing led to another, and I managed to get my way out of it. So, for me, also, I have to say, my food is not a battleground for me. I have always had a natural inclination for good, wholesome, simple food. It's just not a battleground. I mean, I've had to change my diet various times for health reasons, and I usually do it. I don't want to be presumptuous, but I usually do it pretty effortlessly. It's just not a battleground for me. So whether or not I drink coffee is just not going to make any difference. The only reason I bring it up is because it was amazing to me that I would wake up thinking about it. It wasn't really the coffee, it was that, wow, I think about it when I wake up. And that is a little unnerving to me, because I don't want to be bound by something like that. And so that's the reason why it matters. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. And most of the time, if I feel like it, I just have it, because it doesn't matter. But if it did matter, if I had a personality that was also attached to cocaine and to whiskey, then I would have to really think about the roots of that attitude and decide whether or not even this, though harmless in itself, is tied to something that is not harmless. And every person has to make their own decision, which is why you can't really make dogmatic rules. It just depends on where you're standing. And also, Master said you should fight the battles you can win, which is very interesting. He said, if you know that you're going to be defeated by something, run away. Which I just, you rarely get confirmation from the masters for your own inclinations, because if you constantly put yourself in situations where you're defeated, what happens to you is your subconscious gets the picture that you are a person who can't succeed. And to have in your subconscious mind the self-definition that I am a person who can't succeed is far worse for you than just avoiding the situation. It's a very interesting question. It doesn't mean you'll never have to face it. It just means that if I know I can't face it, I'll just leave. I tend to be very available to people and so on, and I say to people, just go ahead and ask anything you want of me, because if I can't do it, I'll just say no. And I do. When I know that I can't, for whatever reason, I just say no. I don't have any problem with that, because if I'm not going to be able to do it well, I just don't want to be involved. That's too much work. I'm not going to handle it. I was recently making costumes for this play, and I've had to do them more than once, and then everybody had opinions, which usually I agree with people's opinions. This time I thought they were all wrong, but they all felt differently than I did, so I had to go along with it. So I finally did it all, and then when I brought all the new costumes in, I said, if you like them, tell me. If you don't, I don't want to know. I'm finished. This is it. And it just seemed like the perfectly natural thing to me, but I realized that, you have to just be able to do that. You have to just say what you say, and you have to protect yourself so that you can. Okay? So what's happening is the superconscious is your friend, and this is what we have to understand. The superconscious wants what's best for you, and sometimes we project upon our superconscious this kind of impossible tyrant. The way Swami put it to me, God does not necessarily want you to be unhappy, that's your idea. Because we sometimes imagine that the superconscious wants us to be way beyond everything we are and wants us to be that way in the morning. One of the reasons I had so much trouble writing, and it sounds ridiculous when I say it now, but this is how I really felt, is because I thought a book was written all at once on Sunday morning. Just like you don't have a book and then you do have a book. And of course, that was impossible, but it was a mindset that I had. I finally realized that a book is written exactly one word at a time. And once I accepted the fact that all I had to write was one word at a time, and then that word made a sentence, and that sentence made a paragraph, and then there was a page, and then gradually you looked back and there was a whole book behind you, completely shifted my understanding. I can write one word at a time. I didn't think I could write a book, but I can write one word at a time. And it's a perfect image of what it is spiritually. We think, I have to, overcome my attachment to my husband. I have to be detached from my children. I have to give up my home. I have to stop drinking coffee with milk, whatever it might be. And we can't see any of it. Because, I was talking to a friend recently who has a lot of talent and a lot of potential and an image of what's possible, which I think is realistic. But I kept saying to him, keep your eyes on your feet. You have your vision, but you've got to look at your feet, because it's not a question of what your vision is, it's a question of what you do with your right foot. Where are you going to put your right foot, and then what are you going to do with your left foot? Because much of the time, we get so interested in our vision, we do not watch our feet. And as a consequence, we never get there, because we're not actually looking at where my 2 feet are right now, and what would happen if I moved it forward. Do you understand? Okay, and actually the subconscious mind will try to persuade you that what the superconscious mind is asking of you is too much. Because the nature of the subconscious is that it prefers low energy. And so the subconscious is happy when you put out less energy. That's what we think about things of being subconscious. Sleep is the extreme example. You just stop putting out energy altogether. And so what your past inclinations want to hold you there because it's the most comfy position. And subconsciousness persuades us that pleasure comes from putting out very little energy. Isn't that it's an interesting way to think about it. I go home and let's see, I could go outside and garden, I could sew this new dress for my granddaughter, I could clean up the kitchen, or I could turn on the television. I think I'll turn on the television, right? And then a long time passes, and we've put out no energy. That's the conscious mind battling between the superconscious and the subconscious. It isn't always a question of realizing God versus getting drunk. It's a question of energy. The battleground of the conscious mind is the subconscious wanting us to follow the accepted pattern that requires the least amount of energy. The superconscious mind says, follow the new pattern, the creative pattern that requires a little more energy. And the experience that we get over many lifetimes actually is that putting out energy is more fun than not putting out energy. And we all know it to a certain extent. I'll invite the family over for Christmas. Oh, it's going to be a lot of work to do all that cooking and make all the beds and invite everybody and then host it and then clean up afterwards. But it's all worth it to us because we know that if we put out all that energy, we're going to have a wonderful experience. And so it's a trade-off that we've learned, and sometimes the subconscious mind even supports us in wanting to do that. But every minute of your life, literally, every minute of your life, the conscious mind is the battleground between the desire for more expanded awareness, and the inclination to just stay with what we know. Does that make sense? And if one actually simply, on the spiritual path, now realize everything is a spectrum, because everything in creation, as long as we're on this plane of consciousness, there's always two poles. So there's always the highest and the lowest in every situation. Now, that spectrum of choices can be moved up the food chain, so to speak, from complete degradation to infinite consciousness. You can be here, 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 anywhere on it. But within yourself, there's always going to be two options. Okay? So, for example, I try not to eat too much sweets because my body doesn't really. My taste buds enjoy them, but it doesn't really help my body. And because of the house I live in, I have many, many guests. Because I have a lot of space. I have some of the only guest rooms in the community, so I have lots of guests coming through, and they all have different inclinations. I hosted for several weeks the whole contingent of people who are here for medical reasons, and their attitude toward dessert was really different than mine. So when they all left, the freezers and the counters were just full of things that I would never buy for myself. So I threw half of it away. That was my compromise. I'd grown accustomed to having ice cream in the freezer, so I didn't throw all of it away. But that was my spectrum. You see? It's like I could have kept it all, or I could have thrown it all away, but I found the point in the middle. I'm getting ready, it's the end of my day, the kitchen is kind of a mess. I can go to sleep with a messy kitchen. It doesn't keep me awake at all. But maybe actually if I just took everything from one side of the kitchen and piled it on the other. So that's the upper end of the spectrum. Do I just walk out, or do I do just this much? If at every moment of your life you realize that battle and just move it a little toward the higher energy part, a little toward the more creative part, even if it looks like a quarter of an inch, you will be astonished that your whole life will change. Because instead of orienting toward the subconscious, you begin to orient toward the superconscious. And you're keeping your eye on your feet. You're thinking, moving the pot from the stove to the sink doesn't really seem like a big gesture toward God realization. But the realization that I can and I will make that choice is beginning to win this battle. And every time you do that, there's that satisfaction. And then the subconscious also remembers that. Because see, what happens here is the superconscious is creative. And this is where I was talking about the writing being creative. But you have to understand, it's creative because it's acting in the now. And when you're acting in the now, you're exactly tuned in to reality as it is, and you're responding to something that has never existed before. When I was talking about my older couple, the older couple who are my friends, she responded to what was existing now that had never existed before. And it was creative because it wasn't based on history. It couldn't be based on history. Her grandniece is sitting across from her, and she has children, one of whom had just been born. And the other man, her husband, was always trying to fit it into what already existed, which is the opposite of creative. So the superconscious, so this is creative, and this is just simply repeating what already exists. So to respond in the moment is just to, you go to the store, and where was I? Who was I talking to? I can't remember. I have this picture in my mind of this person. It doesn't really make any difference, but I was somewhere. I was at this little grocery store up where I was in seclusion, and it was very interesting. There was this young girl in there. She was quite young. She was attractive. She probably wasn't even 20. I tried really hard to relate to her, but it was very interesting to me. Her eyes were just completely dead. And it was, just dead, just worldly, just thinking about herself. And it was really interesting because I was trying to, just pull a little bit of connection. And, she just couldn't have any. She was just completely in what was, and I was trying to bring her some new reality, and she simply couldn't take it. And what I'm saying is at every moment in our life, it's never happened before. So do I apply what's been? With Swami Kriyananda, he could solve any problem. We would, all the rest of us, and we weren't stupid, we were pretty smart cookies, but we would sometimes we couldn't figure it out. And then we'd bring some issue to him, maybe it was a personnel issue or something, and just almost effortlessly, sometimes with the most obvious answer, he would come up with it. But the difference was, we tended to look at what had already happened. He would just look up to what is exactly going on now. And in that, this creative flow of energy would always come to him. So that's what we're working with. Oh, I know what I was wanting to say. The subconscious is merely the repository of what's already happened, which is to say, even though it feels like it has this enormous force, it's only an energy pattern. I mean, there is no thing. We tend to think of it as like this big rock or this freight car that we're carrying. It's nothing. It's just energy. It's just energy pattern. When you die, you don't take anything physical with you. You take an energy pattern with you, which means the energy pattern can be shifted by other energy. And the subconscious mind just collects. And it's really rather stupid in the sense that it doesn't contribute, it just collects. So if you constantly move toward the superconscious, which is why I was saying just that little tiny shift, then the subconscious just gets used to the fact that in all circumstances we just put out a little more energy, because it just blindly repeats whatever you've been doing. So that's why when you start meditating, when you start praying, when you start doing anything that'll help you, especially something that really consciously brings in a higher energy, then the subconscious mind can just suddenly become your friend. Or at least to that extent it can become your friend. I don't know, you'll have the right dream, you'll have the right inclination. When Ananda was, we had 12 years when people were suing us. One entity sued us, a rival church, so to speak. In America, where you can start churches, there's always the first church of, and then for a very long time, the first church of has a monopoly. And so the first church of thinks it owns whatever it is the first church of. And then always, at some point, there's some kind of a split, and then there's the second church of. And the first church of thinks that the second church of has no right to be there. And because they had a circumstantial monopoly, which they begin to think is divinely given. So we got caught in one of those for about a decade. And it finally culminated in this character assassination where we had a woman accusing Ananda of being a vicious cult and so on like that. It was all an extraordinarily complex fabric of lies, but nonetheless there it was. And even though we won the lawsuit that was church against church, we actually lost the lawsuit, which was this woman against us for various reasons, which you can read about in my book. But what was so interesting to me, all of this is prelude. On the Friday morning when we're all sitting in the courtroom and the decision is coming, and we could pretty much see which way the wind was blowing, but when the decision was actually against us, I was amazed and exceedingly pleased with myself. Because my first thought was, oh, that poor woman who won. I said, because not only did she perpetrate this incredible lie, but the fact that she's won means it's going to take her that much longer before she realizes what she's done. You know, that all the negative energy that she set in motion has now been all reinforced with this victory and all the money we're going to have to give her, and she's going to just go on. And so when it finally karmically comes to balance, it's going to be all that much worse. But I was honestly, I have to say, I was amazed that that was the first thought I had. And I mean, that's how I felt the whole time. Oh, that poor woman. What a terrible thing she's done, and now it's all that much worse. Now, where does that come from? That doesn't come from the fact that I liked her, because I didn't, and I don't. You know, I don't think highly of her at all. But it comes because 100,000 other times, when faced with the negative and the positive, with the low energy and the high energy, with the subconscious and the superconscious. We just lean toward the superconscious. And then your good old subconscious mind becomes your ally in this. Your subconscious is neutral. You just program it the way you want to program it. This is where affirmations, positive thinking, that's why people talk about how powerful these teachings are. They're incredibly powerful because we are the sum total of everything that we've done before. And if we don't like who we are, it's actually really simple to change it. I mean, think of it this way. Somebody who's a terrible person, who's just mean and awful to everybody and files frivolous lawsuits and, steals from the widow and the orphan, all he has to do is stop doing that and start doing something else, and he can become a saint. Do you see what I mean? It's just like, it's what you do. It's where you put your energy. You repent of that, and you start behaving in a different way, and it's all different, just like that. Because it's just energy pattern. There's no fixed reality here at all. And so if it's not working for you, find where you can enter into it. And see, that's where, if coffee with milk is essential to your life, just keep drinking it, but be nice while you drink it. Even be nice to yourself. Even just say, it's all right, I do a lot of good things in the world, I can just have this. Swami Kriyananda was extremely balanced in his life. He took holidays, he spent money on nice things when he wanted to, he would stay in nice hotels if he was inclined. He never felt guilty about just living in a very balanced way, and then he was very generous, he was very dedicated to the spiritual life, he was very honorable in everything he did. He was just at ease. It's just at ease. You just find the place where you're going to be and then you live there. Let me think what I was going to say. There was something else. Well, any questions or thoughts or comments on any of that?
I just love the way you have, do you hear me? Is that all right? Yeah, when you bring in your own experiences, it really helps a lot. And I'm thinking about me, physically I have a lot of challenges. Right. So it's just a little tricky to know when I have to put out energy and when I can relax and I have to rest. And right. So I have to deal with that, but I try not to get into, I shouldn't. But it's what's helped me, I think a lot, is to try to keep on asking, Master, what should I do?
Right.
I mean, I do my best with that, and it's this gradual process that really helps instead of thinking, I've got to do everything at once.
Right. Keep your eyes on your feet.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question, and I don't know if
That's all right.
it ties in or not, but I'm wondering where you think the ego falls into this map that you
Where the
put out.
ego fits into all this? Sure, I haven't even used that word, so let me use the word ego now. Here. Okay, let me think for a minute. I'm going to take all this off the board, and then we've got this one. The word is ego. The problem with English is that English was not created by people who had a very deep interest in consciousness. People who spoke English were interested in the world. English, I only speak English, so I don't know. So I'm going to quote Swami Kriyananda, who spoke 8 languages. He said English is one of the finest languages for communication because it has so many more words than other languages do. The first time I went to Italy and just listened to them speak Italian, I said to Swami later, they don't seem to have very many words. And he, being a linguist, said, in fact, they don't. They don't have nearly as many words as we do in English for exactly the same thing. That's where translation gets complicated. So in English, we just have a certain number of words, and we're very, very good at just simply taking everybody else's words. We don't have any English-speaking people just take everybody's words. And now we're beginning to take the Sanskrit words for spiritual things because the language of Sanskrit is designed to describe nuances of consciousness. And so in English, we have the single word ego. And in a lot of spiritual teaching, the ego is just categorically the enemy. And personally, I've never really found that teaching very helpful because it it causes people to be at war with themselves. And I have never observed that being at war with myself or other people being at war with themselves is very helpful. Now, this comes right after my saying the conscious mind is the battleground between the subconscious and the superconscious, but it's all you. You're working with yourself. You're not at war with yourself. It's not like part of you is evil and part of you is good and you have to hate this part and love this part. No, it's just a flow of energy and you have to just commit yourself to who you want to become, but it's all you. So just to say, oh, it's ego, or I'm just trying to overcome the ego, I mean, there's very little clarity in that thought, and oftentimes that lack of clarity leads to a certain lack of sincerity. Because I'm not really, I like these things, I want to keep doing them. That's why I keep doing them. That's why it's easier to think of them as merely my habit from the past, my comfort zone, compared to where I can grow, rather than something evil and wrong about me. Because it doesn't work. Okay, but Yogananda described ego as the, I'll call it the infinite spirit. Sometimes we use the word soul. Okay, the infinite spirit, and I'll identified with limitation. Okay, and another way to put it is simply as the soul identified with the body. But soul is not a very accurate word, and body is also not an accurate word. So it's the infinite spirit identified with limitation, which practically means that the soul, the individual self, is identified with the body, but it's not just the physical body, there's also an astral body, there's even a causal body. So it's that which is infinite is identified with limitation. And that's what ego is. And it's not that it's become limited, it's become identified with limitation. And that's why we're so confused, that we're actually infinite in nature, but because we operate from the level of ego, we have identified, and mostly the way we think about it is this physical body. It's really interesting to contemplate how much of our reality stems from the fact that we identify with this body. It starts by giving us a gender. Okay, someone said gender is the first thing you notice about people and the last thing you forget. When you can remember nothing else, you'll generally say it was a man or a woman, right? Nowadays, because genders are blending so much, sometimes you're not entirely sure, but for the most part, you can tell whether you're dealing with a man or a woman, and you will remember, okay? But for myself, because I identify as a female, I don't identify as a man. And a tremendous number of things follow from the fact that I identify as female. And then I identify according to the parents that I was born to. Then I identify to the place where I grew up with whatever my first language is, which in my case is the only one I have. Whatever country and culture I grew up in. I mean, think about it. If you didn't identify with those things, even if you had them, think how different it would be. And when you meet a very advanced spiritual person, one of the things that you notice is that they don't identify with any of those limited conditions. They seem to be capable of being with whoever they're with. Sri Ramakrishna, who was an avatar who died just before the 1900s, he lived in the late 1800s, he had a very unusual manifestation, and at a certain time he wanted to be Radha to Krishna. He wanted to feel what it would be like to be one of the gopis to Krishna, one of the female devotees. And for 6 months or more, he dressed like a woman and behaved like a woman. So much so that, in a society which was very divided, he would just go into the women's quarters and he would be unrecognizable. He would just be like the women, because his identity was so fluid that he could just shift it. Another time he decided he wanted to be Hanuman. Hanuman is the monkey devotee of Lord Rama. And he literally lived in the trees and ate bananas. And he just became like that, because his ego was so fluid that his infinite spirit could identify with whatever he wanted to identify with. Swami Kriyananda was born to American parents. as it happened, he grew up in Europe and spoke multiple languages. At different times in the course of this book, someone at the very beginning wanted me to call it an American saint or an American disciple, which immediately prompted several letters from Europeans who said, "Did you ever see Swami in Europe? Does he seem the slightest bit American to you when he's in Europe?" You know, they took strong exception to my calling him American because he simply wasn't. He was in a store in Italy with a group of American friends, and the store clerk says to him, and Swami answers in his perfect Italian, the store clerk says, "Well, you're Italian, but who are all these people?" You know, it's just because it wasn't merely that he was good at languages. It was that he didn't identify with the limitations of one body. In other words, he wasn't bound by his ego. And so a great deal of spiritual life is not that we kill the ego or condemn the ego. We just loosen that sense of identification, which loosens the ego's hold on us. I mean, the reason I mention multiple bodies is because you don't get rid of the ego merely by having the physical body die, because the astral blueprint is still there, and if you're attached to that, identified with that blueprint, nothing happens to your ego. You just change one dress for another at that point. Okay? The ego is also your friend, though, you see, because ego, identified with limitation, is also what gives us the self-awareness to realize that this is not a good idea. And so ego can be turned to the ally of spiritual truth. Animals do not make spiritual progress, cannot make spiritual progress in the way human beings can do, because their ego development is insufficient for them to be able to objectify their experience and make conscious decisions according to a principle. Okay, like one dog doesn't say, "Some of my litter mates were adopted into much nicer houses than this one. You know, they get canned food every day and all I get is this kibble. You know, I'm going to go out and find a better neighborhood and see if I can get adopted." I mean, the dog can't think of it. It's just, "Oh, look, master's home. I'm going to go for a walk." I mean, you know, it's like, and then there he's out on the road and he's sniffing everything again. I mean, dogs have personalities, horses, monkeys, all animals, cats, they all have personalities. They all have individuality, but they don't actually, they're not above it, they're below it. And sometimes it makes them much freer because they're not as identified, but it doesn't make them actually, as a group, more spiritually advanced. They haven't risen to the point of identification. They simply exist in this kind of sea. And they're, you know, like everything else, they're more or less evolved. But they don't suffer as a consequence as much as we think they do, because they don't objectify their suffering. They don't personalize it. "Oh, I am suffering. Now I have this disease. What is going to become of me? Why did I get it? If only I hadn't been adopted into this family," you know, like that. They just experience it without identification, which is actually what a saint does on the other end. The things pass through, but he doesn't identify with them. So to overcome ego is not to destroy your ambition and your self-esteem and your capacity to accomplish. It's merely not to identify with that so much. And this is what moves us towards superconsciousness, because the more we're in subconscious, the more we're identified by all those things that happen to me. You know, the ego identifies with, and this is my story, and this is what happened when I was a child, and this is how I feel about it. Or, I mean, people do it exactly the same on the spiritual path. When I was in China, I was a slave, and because I was a slave, I now feel this way, and so I can't do that because it reminds me of that life in China. And, I mean, all of this can be helpful, and I myself am open to hearing those things. The fact that I was told that I helped start the French Revolution has actually been a very helpful thing to me, because I can see that inclination to sort of firebrand rousing the masses, and I can see the limitations of that and have to be careful when those temptations and that desire to become enraged over injustice, you know, knowing that that's all part of me, allows me to stop and think about it. But allow yourself to be defined by those things is to allow your subconscious to rule, because it's only what happened behind you. And the deeper we identify with those things, the more we are trapped by them. Now, between, and this is the second question, one of the second questions that came up during the break, I have been studying these same teachings since I was 19 years old. That would have been 1967, perhaps. 66, maybe 66. That's a long time. And the teachings that I learned then are the same teachings that I'm learning now. Now, of course, in between, I've had hundreds, thousands of hours of fascinating classes and fascinating conversations. And, it's not like I understood it all and haven't learned anything. I've learned continuously. But the most remarkable thing is, as our vibration changes, the words keep changing. The words just keep changing. And so the same word suddenly has a meaning that it simply didn't have before. And literally you read the same books over and over again. Swami Kriyananda's Art and Science of Raja Yoga was first published in like 1969, I think, and then he rewrote it in 72. I got a very early set, and now I have the book, but for 30 years I had the original set that I always had with my own notes. And then when I would reread it, there were new paragraphs. There were new paragraphs, sometimes whole new pages, despite the fact that I had underlined and written notes on the side, because I just couldn't see it. It just went completely past me. Because between an intellectual understanding that this is true and actually getting all those subconscious habits in line, now you have to think of it as energy. It's a balance scale. Or it's just fields of energy, and if you've added a lot of energy here, it has a power. It's a whirlpool. Think of it, the image that always works is best. When I lived up in the country, I used to go sometimes to the Yuba River. If you've ever seen a river, rivers are just marvelous. The Yuba flows actually in a canyon with a lot of rocks. And so the river is flowing, especially in the spring, it's flowing really strongly, and the good old river is on its way to the sea. That's what they all do. And it's just, its determination to get to the sea is really impressive. Nothing holds it back. But every so often, some part of it gets deflected into a whirlpool. And whether it's because it hits the rock in the wrong way, that there's a big log in the path, that sand has built up, whatever, some of that river that's determined to get to the sea instead goes over here. And it just begins more or less to go in a circle. And it'll keep spinning, and if it has enough force, it starts sucking more and more of the river into itself. And so all this trying to get to the sea just keeps getting sucked into this whirlpool. So all of these droplets are determined to get to the sea, but in between they've gotten distracted. And in our chakras, the word vritti means whirlpool. I think I'll deal with the chakras for a minute here, because it helps, the picture helps. The spine is the river flowing like this, and each of the chakras, there's, 1, 2, 3, and then the heart and the throat. Then we have a head up here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we have the spiritual eye, and then we also have this one up here. Okay? Give him some arms and some feet. As you can see, I'm a word person, not an artist. There you have it. And so the river, we want our lives to be run from the awareness of spirit, which is the spiritual eye. The energy actually comes in through the medulla, right here, and it circulates through each of these chakras, like this. And each chakra has something positive to contribute. So when the energy comes in, it picks up the positive potential of every chakra. And then it goes in a constant cycle like this, because this is our life force. This being the earth chakra, the water, the energy always has to go all the way down to the material level. This is what I mean, like every chakra has a positive dimension. We have to go all the way to the earth, or else we're not on this planet. This is the root chakra. We're in a material body. But either the energy can just go out in affirmation of the material world, or it can pick up the qualities of earth, which is commitment, solidity, dedication, loyalty, and then it can carry it and use it in harmony with divine will. At the beginning, I was reminded that I prayed, God, give us the capacity to act in this world in harmony with your will for us. And that's what this prayer, this means. And every time we do something like affirm let's say affirm the material world, we get a commitment here. I absolutely, let's say I need a house. I need a car, I need a bank account. Let's say that we need a bank account for our security. Earth chakra represents security. I need a bank account, I need a sweetheart, and I need a house. Okay? Those are things that everybody seems to want, right? So instead of thinking all strength and energy comes from the divine, if I surrender to the will of God, I'll be taken care of. Instead, I need a bank account, I need a sweetheart, and I need a house, like this. So instead of energy just circulating clean from here, a certain amount of energy has to constantly go into getting a bank account. And I don't just mean that you have to work. I mean that your self commits to, I've got to have a bank account or else I'm going to be scared. I have to have a sweetheart or else I'm going to be scared. I have to have a house or else I'm going to be scared. And so a lot of energy starts building up around these ideas. And there's nothing inherently wrong with these ideas. It's that if we define our security as being absolutely dependent on these things, then to that extent, if God has another plan for us, we can't go with it. Or the thought of going with us absolutely terrifies us, right? And so everything keeps going like this. And over many incarnations, we develop many of these vrittis based on whatever they're based on. And even when we get rid of the physical body, this is the blueprint. We have to have all these things. And so the amount of energy that can flow to the sea, the amount of the river that flows to the sea, is diminished to the extent of all these things that we have to maintain constantly. And we're born with certain feelings, aren't we? Because the ego has identified with the body that it's living in. So it needs a sweetheart, it needs money, it needs a house. It doesn't think, I'm just a child of God passing through this world. If I attune myself to God, everything will be fine. It thinks, yes, but you've also got to take care of yourself. And it doesn't even mean that you don't also have to take care of yourself. There's a difference between taking care of yourself and taking care of yourself. And it is on this spectrum of these realities. Okay? And ego traps you in it, and you go, whoa, I finally managed to do it. I tried 3 times and finally managed. No, just made a big noise. Okay. Thank you. Sure. Let's see if I can knock it again. Turn it just slightly. Okay, there we go. Okay, does that make sense? And this is your subconscious, and this is your superconscious. Your superconscious is always calling you. See, now the thing that you have to see here is that security, and this is water, and this is creativity and flexibility. I'll put flexibility. This is fire, and this is, I'll call it power. This is the heart, this is air. Love, I'll just call it love. Here is, it's called ether, and it's communication and connection. All of those things are necessary, because all of these make the whole of who you are. So it's not a question that I can't be secure or flexible and creative or have personal power or have love in my life or connection and communication. It's just whether it happens guided by attunement with God or whether I'm just reaching out on the level of the world and trying to grab it for myself. Tricky, 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 tricky. Okay? Subconscious, superconscious at war all the time. This is what it looks like. Now this is why it's hard. Because, in the lifetime that I didn't have a house, I was a refugee and I was just all by myself. And if I had only done something about it, in the lifetime in which I didn't really love anyone, I died so lonely. In the lifetime in which I didn't really save money, I ended up being so poor. These things really happen. And then we interpret them in a certain way, and then we get where we started at the beginning. This likes and dislikes, and they just keep moving us. And it's not obvious. That's what makes it so subtle. I mean, it's just, well, that's kind of stupid. If it's not obvious, it's going to be subtle. But that's why we hear it over and over again. But the subconscious has had all these experiences, and it's telling us all these things. And then somewhere along the line, we begin to doubt that conventional wisdom. Who knows why? It's a mystery, but at a certain point, conventional wisdom begins to look a little not so true to us, and it may be because we did everything right and we ended up in Auschwitz and we ended up, just something terrible. Now you could take that in a negative way, or you could realize, wait a minute, I think God is trying to show me something completely else. Viktor Frankl is an extraordinary example of that. He lost everything. And when he lost everything, he suddenly realized that all I've ever had is my inner consciousness. And then he developed when he survived, he developed this whole huge psychological, psychiatric system based on all you ever have is your inner consciousness. So he took a terrible experience, but instead of making all these vrittis of trying to grab, he saw the absolute futility of trying to grab, and saw that the only thing you can ever develop is your inner self. So at some point, these thoughts occur to you. When I was a child, well, I won't take it to myself, that we have this little 5-minute video about Ananda, Palo Alto, it's on our website. It's really very good, and it starts with David Gamow saying, when I was young, I thought there has to be a lasting truth, and I realized that nobody around me knew it, and I determined when I was a child that when I grew up, I would find it. And he said, and eventually he came to the path of self-realization. I mean, it's a perfect definition. I wasn't that clear-minded, but I thought when I was a child that everybody else knew, and that when I got older, they would tell me. And then as I got older and I gradually realized they didn't know, I became quite distressed, because they were all telling me to do this, to just commit myself to all these vrittis. And some part of me already knew that that wasn't going to work. And I was just quite, I just didn't know what I was going to do. I was too sensible to do something reckless, but I was also really quite desperate. And then, of course, God rescued me. He showed me, oh yeah, there's a whole way of living that's just based on the fact that this is all that you want. And once you have that, everything else will follow. But every time you get a little bit of a thought that direction, one of these vrittis just will go out and try to grab it, just like that. Either just inside your own mind, or it'll just send somebody something or something to you, just like this. And that's the subconscious, superconscious. The conscious mind is the battlefield. And I have to say it again, it doesn't mean you can't live and have your house and your money and your beautiful relationship and all your connections. Depends on what you have identified with internally. Because if it's your karma, you have to live through it anyway. But ego becomes the detriment if you identify with it, and your sense of self-worth and happiness then comes from it. Because you're terribly vulnerable at that point. All right? Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back, and then just take a short break and then come back. And then you can ask any questions that are left. I had a few comments during the intermission which seem really important. Okay, one of them was, as I casually said, well, food is not a battleground for me, just because I was putting coffee in perspective. But that's really not taking into account that it is a battleground for a lot of people. But the principle, the more important principle specifically, I said if you have a fight that you can't win, you should run away from it, but that's kind of a hard one to run away from. I mean, let's just use it as an example, because we do have to eat. And, a woman friend of mine who's constantly struggled with weight she said, people can be doing really horrible things in private and no one will know. But if you struggle with food, everybody in the world knows, you know. And so she said it has a different quality about it because you can't hide it, which I thought was a very interesting point, which I had never considered. So the fact is, if you can run away from something, that advice that I was giving, Master said not to imprint your subconscious too strongly with being a failure, but if it is not something you can escape for one reason, for whatever reason, maybe you have a disabled child and you find the care of that child overwhelming, but there's nothing you can do if you're the sole support of that child. I mean, many things happen that it doesn't matter whether we're winning or losing, it's ours and we have to do it. So we have to activate a wholly other side of ourselves, which is this becomes a test of whether or not anybody is in charge of the universe, and whether anybody is in charge of my life, whether there really is a divine force and whether that divine force is guiding me, and whether or not any part of me can find a way to understand that, difficult though this may be, it is for my best interest. And even the process of continually failing has to be for my best interest, because in the end, everything that comes to us from God and is there ultimately for our freedom. Now that is a very, very glib statement that I am not capable of living all the time. Swami Kriyananda always lived that way, and whenever any of us diverted from it even slightly, he would correct us. We were in I think he was having some big physical issue with his back, and I think it was in the middle of litigation. We had so many problems, and he went to the dentist and he didn't have any cavities. And I said, thank the Lord for little favors, you know, just that cliche. Swami absolutely dead seriously said, I thank Divine Mother for everything. I mean, he wouldn't even let me joke. It was just like too serious. And on another occasion, the details of that one escaped me, but it was exactly the same thing. I very flippantly just said something like that. He absolutely would not allow it. It's like, if Divine Mother is in charge of my life and is taking care of me, there's no mistakes here. There may be challenges, I may feel overwhelmed by the challenges, but that becomes then a challenge also to my faith. Now, that's another challenge you can't run away from, even if you're going to lose. And so what I would suggest, I mean, if we're talking about food, if we're talking about a relationship that you can't escape from, or poverty or ill health, I mean, there's a lot of things we can't escape from. We have to ask Divine Mother, what is it that you're trying to teach me? And maybe it's not the incident itself. Maybe it's not being overweight or poor or without a home or alone per se. It may be what happens to my consciousness when this happens to me. And so the test can be about all kinds of other things: resentment, anger, lack of faith in God, always, fear of what? Fear of physical pain, fear of social people not approving of me. So if you can't win the issue, then see what is around the issue that you can begin to deal with. When my parents were at the end of their lives, my mother had Parkinson's for about 15 years, and then the last couple of years of her life, my father, I don't know what happened, but sort of he had some kind of a something, and his mental faculties sort of slipped a lot all of a sudden. He never went into full-blown dementia, but he was not quite normal after that for maybe 4 years. So there was a period of time when, you know, things were a little hairy for them. And I finally came up with a prayer that has been really helpful to me ever since, which is, I said, Divine Mother, I really don't know what you're doing with them. But whatever it is you're trying to teach them, I said, give them the wisdom, the receptivity, and the devotion to learn it. And that became, for me, also a really helpful prayer. I don't know what you're doing with me, Lord, but whatever it is, you know, show me how to learn what you're trying to teach me. And it may be that I don't trust that there's anything good coming from this, and then I have to sort of try to sort that one out. But often it moves very far away from the initial cause. And it goes to everything around it. Why would this happen to me? Why would God send this to me? I had to ask, why would God send this to my parents? From my point of view, or from theirs. But what good thing are you trying to do here? And why am I not tuned into it? And that's the superconscious solution. Because here you are on the spectrum, and if you can't do this, then try to do this. If you can't actually meet the test with flying colors, then try to get some peripheral benefit from it, if you possibly can, until it all works itself out. You see, there's always a superconscious inclination that you can bring to bear in anything. And anything that tells you that you're lost forever and it's not good, that's just the mistake. The way I put it is, this story has a happy ending, meaning the story of my soul. It has a happy ending. So if I'm not at the happy ending, I'm not at the ending. And that has helped me a lot. Yeah, I'm just in a chapter in which the heroine struggles, whatever that might be. But that's just a chapter, because the end of the book is going to be a happy ending, whether this life or the next life or the next or the next. But if I stick with the plot and keep turning the pages, Okay. Now, the other thing that came up in that same discussion is the question of affirmations. And I'm going to use this opportunity to just make a little corrective here, which I think people make a lot of mistakes. This is the same comment as you've got to watch your feet and figure out, keep your eyes on your feet. I know that sounds funny. But once you know the big goal you're going for, the issue, many people do not realize their dreams because they're looking so much at their goal, they're not watching where they put their feet, or they're not even moving their feet. They're just waiting for the goal to be realized. So a lot of people teach affirmations, and what they teach is they always tell you, they give you these giant affirmations. I am whole, I am perfect, divine power flows through me, nothing on this universe or any world can ever touch me, I am free, I am free. I'm not. And every time I say something like that, most of my subconscious mind says, oh, come on, are you kidding? And so not only, speaking for myself, does it not work, it actually reinforces the opposite. If the affirmation is so much bigger than any part of you can really connect to, the more you say it, the weaker you will get. And I have seen this a great deal. I used to call them, 30 years ago, I used to call them refugees from the New Age, because they would get these overblown teachings without anything concrete under them, and then they would come to me and think they were failures. I can heal myself of all failures, I can have prosperity, I can have a perfect relationship, and they're saying all these affirmations, and zip is happening. Because it's not connected. And as I said, it's weaker. So the most important thing about an affirmation is that you actually believe it. That it has to be grounded in something that you can genuinely embrace. Of course, it needs to be bigger than you are, because that's the whole point. But it has to, in some way, be within your realm of experience, and then just one step beyond, not 100 steps beyond. The affirmation that I used for a very long time was, I know God's power is limitless, and as I am made in His image, I too have the strength to overcome all obstacles. I was using that some 25 years ago. Because I did know God's power was limitless, and I did believe I was made in His image. So those two things, I was solid. That therefore it would give me the strength to overcome all obstacles was a little dicey, but because I believed the first two sentences, I was kind of trapped by my own philosophy that the chances were pretty good, that therefore. But every time I would do it, I could do the first two with solid, and then my area of growth was the next ones. But it was the right size. It was bigger than my consciousness, but it was connected to my consciousness. I had a woman who had worked in research labs for years and loved the work, but developed allergies to some of the materials they had to use. So she'd taken a long sabbatical, and then she was about to go back to work. And her affirmation is, I am whole, I am healthy, I live in God's light, nothing can touch me. And she told it to me like that, and I said, you don't believe that, do you? And she said, no. And so it's like she was trying to go back to work, but she was affirming all the way through. She was saying, whatever the words were, her subconscious was feeling the threat. The affirmation completely reminded her of the threat, not of the solution. So we came up with one that was something like, I love God, and every day I will do my sincere best to live according to His plan for me. I mean, she could say that with her whole heart. And it didn't bring up any specter of allergy or job or joblessness. She could say it with her whole heart, but it gave her strength. I mean, unfortunately, I can't tell you what happened after that. But that her entire demeanor changed because that was true. She could say that was true. I was talking to someone not too long ago, and they were really playing the game of, which is a very sad game, of I'm never good enough, I don't meditate very well, I've been trying to meditate, I can't meditate, I'm just an awful devotee, and so on like this. And I just didn't know how to help her. And then somehow or another, she started talking about her belief that God loves her. And in the midst of all of this, she had this extremely powerful feeling that God loved her no matter what. And I said, well, that's where you need to go. You don't need to affirm today, I will do 108 Kriyas twice a day, and this will be the first day that I will always do 108. No, let's not talk about that. Let's say, Divine Mother is so beautiful and so generous, she loves me no matter what. And and all of a sudden she was happy and she was dynamic, and you could see how everything would flow from that. Divine. So you start where you can stand. And fortunately for her, despite her sense of her own terribleness, she somehow believed that God still loved her, which that was good news. And so we just started there. That's what Master meant by run away. He meant run away from the part that's weakening you and find the part that's going to strengthen you. It doesn't matter what it looks like. I mean, what happens externally is annoying, but not relevant always. What happens internally is all that matters. We are destined to fail in many incarnations. It's just what it is. And the lesson is about failure, not success. Swamiji remarked about a certain man in our wider circle for whom everything seemed to go well. And Swami said, yes, but you haven't seen all the incarnations when he worked so hard to earn all this good karma. You think it's effortless for him, but he wasn't always. He just brought himself to this point by powerful, courageous perseverance. So, any other questions or comments or thoughts? Yes?
Well, for me anyway, it's that patience is a virtue, and stick with it.
Well, my spiritual advice has become down to 2 words: don't quit. It doesn't matter. All failure is temporary. The other thing that I've often said is everything is the patient application of willpower. And that's the same as watch your feet. Just keep putting forward. And even if you're failing now because of karma that's too strong. But if you don't want to fail in future, just resist. Master said that. You don't have to succeed, you just have to resist. What are you going to say?
I have a question about, did you call them rutis?
Vrittis?
The
Whirlpools.
The whirlpools, yes.
Vrittis.
How do you spell that?
I will.
Thank you.
Yeah, these.
So the question is, are there ways to learn about those within ourselves? Is it through meditation, or are there other means by which we can become more aware of those
Vrittis?
ritis? Yes.
Well, let me first, before I answer that, because this is the most important thing to say about vrittis. If you think of vrittis as the conflict between the river trying to run to the sea and the river getting deflected into a whirlpool, you can either go into the whirlpool and untangle it, or you can increase the flow of the river. because it is the dynamic relationship between these two forces that causes the whirlpool to exist. Think of it as a physical river. The whirlpool, there's the force of the river going to the sea, and there's the force of the pull of the vritti. And they're in a dynamic relationship. The vritti has to be stronger than the flow of the river to the sea, even to exist. But if the flow of the river to the sea becomes stronger, the whirlpool will be absorbed and it will disappear, and you'll never have to even know it was there. You'll just suddenly feel a sudden increase in freedom. And this is the metaphysical explanation of the statement, don't worry about anything, just meditate. Because if you meditate and increase power here, what that does is increases the flow of energy up the spine, and then all of these vrittis, that have less of a hold on you than your increasing energy in the flow of the river, they just gradually go away. In our particular path, the practice of Kriya Yoga, which is our particular kind of meditation, which it vastly increases the energy here, and then all the chakras are magnetized upward in a very specific ways according to the technique, then all of this karma just begins to dissolve. And you don't even know it. When I my first years on the path, I just began to change without my even knowing what or why, because all of the vrittis that I was carrying that had less magnetism in themselves than I now had for my upward aspiration were just being swept in. And so that distracting energy that I was not even aware of with my conscious mind, the distraction was gone, and all that energy that had been distracting was now positive. And this is why just people, especially if you meditate by Kriya or something like it that works in a very scientific way with the chakras, you can just change without it. You don't even need to bother. Okay, now, how we find, but see, sometimes, if you're thinking of a river in the whirlpool, sometimes when the whirlpool is drawn into the river, rocks and trees and things can crash into the river and make a big thing happen. Sometimes they just get absorbed and you don't even notice. So if they get absorbed and you don't even notice, you might not notice for 3 or 4 years or 5 years or 2 months, and then suddenly some situation that has happened in your life before will happen again, and you will respond completely differently. When my response to the verdict in that lawsuit, it was like a lot of vrittis had been dissolved for me to spontaneously feel that way, because just a lot had happened and a lot of karma. So I didn't really even know they were being dissolved until I responded intuitively like that, and nothing pulled my energy in another direction. So it's like, oh, look at that. We've learned something here. And I could have called those vrittis revenge, anger, anything. They could have been many things that I didn't really know I was letting go of until I was tested. And then sometimes you know what a vritti is because a lot of something happens to you. Just like, oh my God, your job, your relationship, your money, your health, just, some big thing happens. I like to think of it as a vritti being released, that some karma, because that's what a vritti represents, some karma is just, and that's how you find out what your vrittis are, is because they manifest in the world. And that's why when I was saying it's not necessarily the thing that happens, it's what it prompts in you. So the vritti, might have been about your children, but it really might be a vritti of control or expectation. But it looks like your children because that's what's going to unlock the vritti of control or expectation. And the other way you tell is you just pay attention to your life. You start noticing what are the patterns. Instead of why do I always end up working with such awful people, you say, why do I always end up working with such awful people? It's the same question, not God, why are you doing this to me, but God, why are you doing this to me? Because it's written all over our lives. Any bad relationship you get into, anybody who you get mad at and can't let go of, anybody as you see as evil and is doing bad things to you, those are your vrittis. Any preoccupation with, oh dear, I'm getting old again, and it's like nobody's going to love me, I have to have some more surgery, just, these are your vrittis, everything you're inclined toward. Those are your vrittis. It's not mysterious at all. Why was you born in that culture? Why were you born in this family? Why do you have this language? Why do I choose these colors for my house? Just everything. Those are all your vrittis. It's all over. Okay? Anything else? We're in the last minutes here. The clock is ticking. It's almost done. Oh, yes. Kathy was reminding me that any class that's about chakras, karma, or reincarnation will go into this in great detail. There's a vast amount that can be said. I just am cherry picking off the top. And also online, on my own website, Asha Joy, and then the YouTube channel that's off of that. You can type in the subject, and I don't think you can type in vrittis, but you can type in chakras, and it tells you lots. Chakras, karmas, reincarnation, that's what you're looking for. Okay? My own website, Asha Joy. Right. I had to make that up for the radio. Something that people had a slim chance of remembering. Yeah. Okay? I think that's it. Thank you all very much.